Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
I'm glad to welcome back returning guest Janice Selbie from Canada. We're going to be talking about CORT2022. So welcome back, Janice.
Yay! Thanks for having me back.
You know what? I was thinking in the lead up to this discussion we're having now about your upcoming conference, you've been on my show more than anybody. I'm sure of that. You've been on there more times. Nice. I don't know if that's a good thing. It's a good thing. I always love talking to you. It's wonderful to touch base. We did talk, I guess it was before Christmas, didn't we, about your divorcing religion workshop. So how did that go, by the way?
Oh, they've been going really well. Actually, every time I've done them, I've just been so glad to do them, get a new round of a new group of people every time from all different backgrounds. The last one I did actually happened to be all women. From different backgrounds, but I have had them. I did one where I had all men who had been pastors before, and that was really interesting, an interesting dynamic. And folks have come from Orthodox Judaism and Mormonism and just many different backgrounds, and it's a really supportive environment for people to explore some of their own religious trauma and start building their supportive secular network.
It's so important. I'm glad you're doing that. I know you run those all throughout the year, so even if people can't make the CORT 2022 and they want to get in touch with you, that's a good way, isn't it? How many do you do a year, those divorcing religion workshops?
Sure. I've been doing about 3 or 4 per year, and that seems to be going well. I'm starting another one tomorrow, and it'll be a smaller group, and that also is just fine because it's just very intimate and it gives people lots of time to talk and process. So it's one of my favorite things is doing group work. I really enjoy it. So it's kind of, I feel selfish doing it because I like it so much.
Yeah, but it's such a valuable thing, isn't it? So I'm so thankful that you're doing those. But you've got a big conference coming up again now, CORT 2022. I still can't believe this. I said this the last time we talked. I think it was last year. It just seemed like yesterday that my sister Valerie and I visited you, and you came down from Kelowna, BC. Yeah. We came up to Vancouver, and that was supposedly for CORT 2020, which didn't happen in the end because of COVID, didn't it?
Yeah.
So now we're doing the second round of CORT 2022, and it's all online, which is cool.
That's right. Yeah, the conference on religious trauma, and it's taking place again online. Although I hear from lots of people, I hear you guys saying that you sure wish we could be getting together in person. And I'm not quite ready to do that, not till everything is quite safe as far as the virus goes. But so this one will be online in April 29th to May 1st. And I have a few of the same guests from last year, some of the really big names, Dr. Daryl Ray, Dr. Marlene Winnell, of course, Dr. Clint Haycock, and then some new folks joining us as well. So it's going to be fresh. We've got some very interesting topics, and this time it'll only be the 3 days, really one evening and 2 full days, as opposed to last time I ran it over 5 days, which was just crazy.
That's a lot, isn't it? So is it like last year, is it a case where if people can't attend the actual sessions online, can they access the recordings afterwards?
Absolutely. Every session will be recorded. And that works out really well for folks who are in different countries, different time zones, or people who just have some financial constraints, because it's roughly half the price to buy simply the recordings. Now, if you purchase the all access pass so that you're attending live online, then you have the opportunity to ask questions of the speakers. And we're having several more socializing events this year throughout the conference, because we heard from people that they really, really loved those. It was kind of like an online cocktail party, this virtual cocktail party type scenario where the speakers are in the room and people just come and go. You find your own group who you want to talk to and what questions you have. That went over really well. So we'll be doing more of that as well for folks who have the all access pass.
I still look back on last year's conference on religious trauma. That was one of the best experiences I had, probably one of the highlights of my year, because we were so fortunate to be on a panel with Tim Sledge, David Hayward, the Naked Pastor, and Dan Barker from the FFRF, the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
Yeah.
All of us ex-pastors. That was such a good discussion we had. I'm still buzzing about that here, almost a year later.
Yeah, it was really enjoyable. It was so authentic, very down to earth. I know it touched a lot of people because we did have, I'm sure, a number of pastors and people who had just been involved in ministry who attended. And this year, so now I have a different dedicated website. It's religiostraumaconference.org, and people go there and they find out about the conference, and then they click for registering and it takes them to register. But with this new website, I got this app on my phone that lets me know every time someone visits the site, and it's been incredible, like well over 1,000, 1,500, maybe not quite 2,000, but moving in that direction. That's how many people have visited just since January, since I got it online. And they are visiting from all over the world. I've had people from Beijing, from Saudi Arabia, from the Congo, from Kenya, Ireland, all over Europe, every state except Wyoming in the United States and Canada as well. So lots of interest being generated. Boy, if only each one of those people would buy a ticket, wouldn't that be something?
Yes, thousands of attendees. But it's such a valuable resource, isn't it? It's so good. Yeah. And I've going to share with you later on, I've gotten some messages from people. A woman messaged me on Twitter the other day from New Zealand, and she was asking specifically about religious trauma. So I wanted to share that with you maybe later. And then I saw a post from a woman on Facebook, a friend of mine. I won't mention her name, but it's, when we get into this topic of religious trauma, it's family sort of dynamics and all that, which I think so many people resonate with. But maybe before we get started, we did this last year, but we have to do it again. I think we need to maybe have a thumbnail sketch of what is religious trauma syndrome and why is it so important to have this conference on religious trauma?
Right. Yeah. It's even though the concept is catching on and taking root that religion actually is traumatizing for a lot of people, it's important that we still are clarifying and kind of letting people know what we're talking about, because when I'm typically talking with someone and I say I'm a therapist and I do work exclusively with people who've had religious trauma, people automatically think I'm talking about priests and small children and horrible things that have gone on there. And that certainly is a form of trauma that occurs under the guise of religion. But I'm specifically looking at religious trauma syndrome. And so you've had Dr. Marlene Winnell as a guest on your program before. And Dr. Winnell wrote a very important book called Leaving the Fold, which I recommend for everyone who's recovering from religion, essentially. And she's the one that coined the phrase religious trauma syndrome. And she uses that phrase to describe the symptoms that so many of us experience, first as we are part of an authoritarian group or a high demand group or a fundamentalist religious group, because we suffer within the context of that. There are things that are denied us, things we're not allowed, things we have to reject, things that are imposed on us. And then, if we have the courage or we're able to leave that group, or even if we get kicked out of that group, we have more losses and more difficulties and sorrow that come our way, more traumas as a result of leaving that group. So it's that real double whammy. You're stuck with it when you're in there, and then you're stuck with it when you're out. So there's a tremendous amount of grief and grieving and loss that we need to acknowledge in order to be able to mourn it adequately, and just helps us understand more about ourselves. And sometimes even the symptoms can be physiological. You know, we can be having trouble sleeping. We can be having digestive troubles. There are just lots of issues that can go along with this type of trauma. Certainly, relationships are impacted. If you're constantly angry, you're seething with this anger over the fact that your parents forced you into this, and then you lost so many years of your life to it, invested so much of your money, you didn't go to school, you didn't marry the person you wanted, whatever. Then you can just have this anger and it's consuming you, and it disrupts relationships. So that can also be a part of religious trauma syndrome.
So many layers and elements to it. I actually went through Leaving the Fold probably about 4 or 5 months ago. For some reason, I'd never read the book. I don't know why. As you said, I talked to Marlene Winnell. Unfortunately, she's kind of limiting her appearances now because she's semi-retired, I guess. But because I've gone back to her and said, "Oh, I went through your book. Can we please talk again?" And she turned around and said, "Well, I'm just too busy. I'm trying to limit my appearances," which I'm glad to hear that she's going to be at the CORT 2022, because
yeah, me too.
Such a valuable resource, isn't she?
Yes, she really is. And I'll put in a plug for her group called Journey Free. People can go to her website, journeyfree.org, and she has a really large, extensive support group and forum through her website for people who are recovering from religious trauma.
Yeah, there was a lot of things that struck me about the book. That one of the things she mentioned is those of us like me who grew up in a fundamentalist context. So I grew up in a very strict Christian home. I've talked about this before. My parents followed the Bill Gothard Institute in Basic Youth Conflicts, which I believe is a cult. And I was raised in that context. But she talks about when you're in church, and this is something I'd never really made this connection before. In evangelicalism, we always used to talk about, you have to wear a mask. We got to strip the mask off and be our real selves. But to fit into the group, we had to kind of become another different person. And when she talked about in the book, she said, basically what's happening is you're putting a mask over your authentic, true self. And the longer you do that, the more trauma you're basically doing to yourself. That's not you. And she said in the book that every time you have an objection or a question or a doubt about something the pastor said or something in the Bible or something about God or whatever, that's your authentic self basically trying to come out and say, hey, this doesn't make sense. And we stuff that down, we repress it, we suppress it, and you're doing damage. And that's part surely of this religious trauma syndrome, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's such a great way to put it. And it seems to me, when particularly for those of us who are second gen, like you and I, who were born into it, or our parents, became religious and we didn't really have any say in it. For me, my personality and my views did not have a chance to develop apart from my parents' religious views. And so then eventually when I try and do all the right things, marry someone who is very religious and going to be a pastor, and raise my kids extremely conservatively. And then eventually it just feels like a corset that's been pulled too tight, or that beach ball held beneath the water for too long. And the real me was demanding to come out. I couldn't keep that mask on any longer. And it was very messy when finally all blew apart. So, and when I hear from, one of the most common things I hear from clients who are working their way through religious trauma is how devastated they are at the thought of losing the relationship with their parents. And it's so terribly sad that Christian parents, and not just Christian parents, fundamentalist parents, so they could be Orthodox Jews, could be Muslim, could be Mormon, their love essentially comes with strings attached. They will love you deeply and have, a close, loving relationship with you as long as you toe the line. And the minute you reject that religious aspect of it, their fear kicks in, So they have terrible fear that we are going to hell or whatever. We're going to be separated for eternity. But then I think on some level, there's also the fear of apostasy that's lower down, that they're not quite willing to admit or accept. And so the relationships of necessity become shallow, or, there's such a limit on what we can talk about. Now we can only talk about how our kids doing in sports or schools.
Absolutely. Well, this is a great segue, because one of the things I mentioned earlier, I've got something to share. Someone on Facebook, I won't mention her name, but she posted the other day that her mother, her fundamentalist mother, and she's left the church, left the faith, but her mother is still very much into it. And she messaged her the other day, and it was this whole thing about, she says, I was always a supportive mom, and loving you was never a weakness or fault of mine. You were dedicated, baptized, and filled with the Spirit. And she goes on to say, despite your rebellion, meaning she's left the faith, and the way Satan has deceived and twisted your truth, God is real and the end is very near. Once Russia puts their foot in it, Israel will hit the fan. When it does, the rapture is going to happen. And she goes on and on. This whole thing about the war in Ukraine with the Russian invasion. And it's just this classic thing. That's another element, isn't it? Where family can be so toxic after we've left that cult or religion, when they're still involved in it.
Right. And thinking in terms of the parent in that equation, and you and I are both parents, and at one time we also believed, very devoutly. We felt that our greatest task, the one task at which we must not fail, was to indoctrinate our children with the truth of the gospel message. Anything else was small potatoes. What really mattered was that our children signed on the dotted line, said the magic words. Their hearts belonged to Jesus. And so it is such a sense of failure, combined with the fear and the confusion that parents have because they feel, well, they did love us, they did provide for us, and they tried to do everything right, but the outcome is not what they wanted or expected. So having a degree of compassion for the family member who remains deeply entrenched, while also being able to maintain our own boundary for our own mental health. Mom, I'm so sorry that you are having these concerns. I know it must be incredibly distressing for you. I've made my decision. I'm happy with the life that I'm living. And because it causes you so much distress, and it causes me upset when I know you're this distressed, I don't want to talk about this anymore with you. So
you have to set those boundaries. This topic is going to have
to be off limits. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And if I feel the need to bring it up with you or share things with you, I will. But for right now, this topic can't be part of our conversation. And I just love you so much. And what else can what other things are going on in your life? So trying to be kind, still, and gentle, and affirming our love for them, while at the same time doing our own adulting, parenting ourselves. Okay, that's a dangerous thing, so I'm going to stay away from that thing.
It's true.
It's a tall order.
Yeah, I've come to see I believe, like you said, the indoctrination of children by fundamentalist or cult parents, it is a form of abuse. One of the books I'm going through now is Dr. Janja Lalich's Escaping Utopia, which is a really good book, off the back of Take Back Your Life, which is also a helpful resource. But the reason I picked up Escaping Utopia was that I think she interviewed something like 65 people who had left some form of a cult or religious group of all different stripes. And she interviewed all these people, these men and women. And she said, in one of the points, one of the people who left the cult said, we didn't have a choice. We didn't have a say. We were born into it. And I really resonated with that, because I thought, that's damn straight. I did not have a say. I was raised in a fundamentalist religious Bible cult, and I was indoctrinated in all the things that caused, religious trauma syndrome in me, rapture anxiety, fear of hell, fear of a surveilling God. One of the things she talks about is this idea that, God is always watching us. That's the view that we had. So you develop things like religious scrupulosity. Everything you do, every thought is a potential sin. And for a kid, that is hugely traumatic. It's got to be so damaging.
Yes. And when I hear from people, which is frequently, who are struggling, even, they've been able to leave religion behind, or as I say, divorce religion. But there is that lingering fear of hell. I do have them stop and try and remember when they were introduced to that concept of Jesus dying for their sins, of, that there is a place, a horrible, terrible place of torment and torture, and for a lot of people, we were 5 years old. That's the same time we were finding out about Batman, like that, and we didn't have the ability to discern between, well, which one of these is fact and which one of these is fiction. And it's just a terrifying thing. And when that information is being instilled in you by your trusted parent who is responsible for your life, of course, we're going to absorb it and take it in. And there's a lot of terror with that, which makes it particularly hard to kind of expunge those beliefs, because they were inculcated with fear. So people need
rooted.
to be patient. Yes, we need to be patient with ourselves, continue doing our research, continue listening to stories and watching stories about how other people have coped with this and overcome this fear, so that it no longer is weighing them down. Yeah, it's a pretty significant one. And then, of course, the whole idea of being unequally yoked. So people marry as believers and then one stops believing, or vice versa. People marry as non-believers and one starts believing. Both of these are very, very hard situations. And this year at CORT, we're actually going to be having David teach out, talking about that, navigating life with the unequally yoked, basically, in our situations when one of you stops believing. And we're also having Jennifer French speak on coercive control. So kind of the earlier topic related to cults. And Jennifer was involved in a Christian mystic cult for over 10 years of her life. And now she's become an expert and done her schooling and her master's on the topic of coercive control. So I'm really looking forward to what she has to say. We have a lot of interesting and very different topics this year than the ones that we had last year.
It is fascinating. And I know we're not talking necessarily about cults per se, but that's a fascinating insight that most cults, this is something that Janja Lalich talks about in Escaping Utopia, the psychology of virtually every cult is eerily similar, isn't it? You see the same dynamics, the same mind control, the same behavior control. She calls it, systems of influence, systems of control, the sort of bounded choice. You think you're operating out of free will, but actually you're not. You're in a context. You're in, as Lifton would say, it's milieu control. You're being controlled. And we find that does produce a lot of religious trauma, doesn't it? Being within that coercive control situation.
Yeah, it really messes with our mind. And so that even if we are able to leave, then we're stuck with this problem of can I trust myself? Like, I believed that for 40 years of my life. What else am I believing that is not true? Who can I believe? I mean, I trusted my parents. I trusted my pastor. If I can't trust them to know the truth, who can I trust? And then, when you're having people from your religious life reaching out to you, like your parents or your pastor, we're concerned, you're on the road to perdition, whatever type of thing that they say, it feels so hard, especially in the beginning when you still have maybe some doubts about, well, what if they're right? I know lots of people right now with the stuff going on in Russia and Ukraine are saying, oh, it's Gog and Magog, remember hearing all that kind of stuff. Yeah, Armageddon, it's just around the corner, everything's coming true, when in reality, Earth is a pretty crowded place. We have lots of people with lots of different viewpoints, and unfortunately, a lot of people who make it into positions of leadership and authority are malignant narcissists, dictators, greedy people out to pursue gain for their own ends. And that's just the nature of people. It doesn't actually mean that, oh, it's this one thing that the Bible or Nostradamus or whatever talked about. It just means this is the nature of people. And as long as there are people, there are going to be wars. And long before the Bible was written, there were wars and famines and pestilences and just all sorts of things that come as a result of living on this particular planet.
It's true. And that's kind of edging into the topic that I'm going to be talking about, which is evangelical involvement in politics, and then linking it to religious trauma. I know we're not really covering that in this chat, but what I'm fascinated, like that woman on Facebook, that whole thing about the end of the world because Putin's invaded Ukraine has triggered so many Christians, so many evangelicals, that this is Armageddon. And so therefore they're now going into overdrive and causing more religious trauma for this poor woman. Now her mom's freaking out because, oh my God, it's all going to happen. Now this is, it's all kicking off.
And of course, we know as well that in times of uncertainty, so social and cultural and, world uncertainty, that is exactly when people want a strong man in power, someone who is promising, I'll do it, it'll be fine, it's an easy fix. But actually, life is complex. Simple solutions don't often work for complex problems. And it's our fear. It's that I want a parent to tell me what's right from wrong. I want a parent to protect me. And so people give up their autonomy and they go racing to figures like Trump or Putin, or they go to church, wanting that assurance, that certainty, security, and order that people really crave.
It's true. And we know there's a strong Christian nationalist piece to what Putin's doing as well. So that's another element. But I was thinking too, when we were talking about people who've left the church or a cult, another example of the religious trauma that he comes on the back end is a lot of times you don't have any real job or life skills. Because again, going back to Janja Lalich's Escaping Utopia, she talks about there was a couple who left. I think they were in the Children of God cult, and they were in it for something like 30 years. And they married while in the cult, but then they both escaped, but they had absolutely no marketable skills because all their work had been dedicated to supporting the cult. All their money went to the cult. They basically worked for nothing, and so they sat in their house on welfare playing video games all day because they just didn't know what to do next. So that's another piece where you've dedicated your whole life to this religion. If you walk out of it, you might have no marketable skills to even get a job.
That's right. And actually, at the Conference on Religious Trauma, one of your former guests, Ryan Stoller, he will be talking on the topic of traumatic homeschooling and how evangelicals use education to totalize. And then it's going to be a panel with Ryan and also Beatrice Weber, who comes from an ultra-Orthodox Jewish background, and she's taken the New York State school district to court because she has to share custody with her husband, who remains ultra-Orthodox, and he insists that the sons go to this particular school and they don't learn anything other than the Torah. So they're not learning math, they're not learning. So Beatrice will be talking about it, and Elam Zook was raised Amish, and Elam will also be talking with us about some of the pitfalls of strictly religious schooling, and that ends at grade 8 or whatever age it is, because these are important topics for people to know about. And there are lots of people who are secular who are able to homeschool their kids and provide them with an excellent education, in fact, but when it's driven by religious fundamentalism, pardon me, that's when trouble comes in.
It's true. And we know, this is an article that I just wrote last year in the Public Research Journal, Public Eye, about Christian homeschooling in the age of COVID. And this is another element that's come out of that. They can be so deceptive, basically, because when parents when their schools were closed down during the lockdowns, A lot of them had no alternative but to homeschool their kids to keep them on track academically.
Yeah.
And what they found was pre-made curriculum from homeschooling websites and things like that, which seems like an easy win. It's all right there. You just plop down your money and pay, and you get all this wonderful curriculum. What they didn't realize, a lot of it had that fundamentalist, dominionist Christian worldview attached to it. And that's something that Ryan and I talked about on our episode, because he was a product of that system as well. So I didn't go to Christian homeschool, but I was in Christian schools. So I experienced some of that same kind of religious trauma in Christian school myself.
Oh yeah. And one other topic that's kind of similar, like with the nationalism and everything. Mandisa will be talking about. She'll be talking about the church, politics, and racism, and how they all link together. Because we know that there's a lot of crossover there, and we see that coming out today in what we consider the uglier, the kind of the seedy underbelly of the GOP or the Republican Party, and really, conservative politics around the world. Racism does tend to factor in there.
It's true. I just went through a good book called White Evangelical Racism by Anthea Butler, and that's a good resource if people are interested in that connection. She goes through all the way back to basically slave owning days in America and traces that sort of white evangelical racism. So yeah, there's a lot of good resources out there, but that sounds like a fantastic episode. Coming up in just a few minutes, we're going to get back into the second half of this chat with my good friend Janice Selbie as we continue to talk about what's coming up on the CORT 2022 conference. We're going to get into some other issues. We're going to talk about first generation cultists. What does that mean? We didn't get into that. We talked about second, third, fourth generation, people like me and her who were born into it. But what about the people who joined it, a group or a religion or a cult, later in life and then got out? Is it a different journey for them? What about religious trauma? And then we're also going to touch on Christian homeschooling and some other things. You're also going to hear how you can get a discount for this important conference, and Janice is going to mention that, and I'm also going to put that in the show notes as well. But before we get back into the chat with Janice, I wanted to tell you what is coming up here in the next few episodes here on Mindshift Podcast. I mentioned that the other day I've had a really fantastic couple of conversations. One with returning guest Catherine Stewart, the author of The Good News Club and The Power Worshippers. And we had a really good conversation about what's going on in the Christian right, really embracing the big lie of Donald Trump and how that's playing out in terms of some of these political action groups and so forth. And then I also had a chat with Rachel Hunt from the Recovering from Religion organization, and she's got a lot of really good information on how you can get involved in the RFR, either whether you're seeking support from a group that they run, or if you're looking to become one of the facilitators of an online discussion or an online sort of a support counselor, a lay counselor. So that's a really good discussion. I'm also in chats with another very good friend, a returning guest as well. Of course, my good friend Frank Schaefer. And we're trying to set up when we can actually book this in. And then speaking of booking in, we got a couple things coming up. I've been asked to do a presentation this Sunday, the 13th of March, for the Florida Atheists. And I'm going to be doing a talk on the rise of dominion theology and the Christian right. And if you want to find out more information about that, look the Florida Atheists up on their website. And the link to that, you can join it as a meetup. That's on their calendar. That's coming up on Sunday the 13th. And then we got a couple of Mindshift Zoom calls booked in. We've got Michael from the Religious Addicts Anonymous. He's going to be dropping in this month on the 20th of March. And then in April, I think it's the 24th. It's also a Sunday. We've got Dr. David DeAndre. He's going to be coming back, and he'll be our guest in the month of April. So how can you get into these Zoom calls? These are fantastic. We do them every month. We had one with Rebecca Drumsta, and this month, and then of course we have Michael and Dr. David DeAndre. You can become a part of those. You can get access to those by being a Patreon supporter of the show, and you also get access to our patrons only call as well. So that's how you can become a part of that. So anyway, let's get on back into the second half of this conversation with Janice Selbie as we continue to look at CORT 2022, the Conference on Religious Trauma. I wonder too, though, what about, we didn't talk about people who joined a religion later in life, because you've got sort of these first generation and then
Right.
second, third, fourth, like you and I, we were raised in it. We had no
Yeah.
choice. Is it different for people who, let's say, come to a cult or a religion later in life and then leave it? Are they on a slightly different journey in terms of religious trauma and then recovery?
Yeah, absolutely. Because first gens who join groups as adults, their personality, their basic temperament, their views have already had a chance to form. They already have the basic knowledge of who they are. So that gets kind of hijacked or covered over so that a new sort of personality emerges during their cult years or fundamentalist years. But then when they're able to leave the group, they still do often really require kind of exit counseling or working with people like me who can talk with them about the trauma that went on and how they can be rebuilding the pieces of their life and getting in touch with those old parts of themselves that were there already and are still there. But it's still kind of a painful and difficult process, but it is decidedly different from those of us who were born into it.
It really is. I've talked to several people who joined a cult or a fundamentalist group, and it seems like it's like whatever point they join that group and develop that religious identity, as you say, suppressing their authentic self, their growth kind of stops. And then when they leave the group, they've got to go back and recover that. I remember talking to John Atack a few years ago, and he's an ex-Scientologist, and he said that that's where you see a lot of people, let's say they were in their adolescence and then they joined a group. They have to go back and then they kind of become teenagers again. You know, they might be in their 50s and they suddenly, you know, for men, they grow their hair long and they go get a tattoo and they go crazy and, you know,
and women cut their hair and get a tattoo.
Exactly. Shave your head up, you know. And that's a different thing for those of us we never had an adolescence. My adolescence, like yours probably, was completely in the religious context. So for me, it's more about a journey of discovering who am I, sort of full stop. I didn't have a stunted adolescence. I didn't have one. I was sitting in a church service somewhere, you know.
And I think we need to be able to, of course, extend compassion to folks who joined high demand groups in adulthood. The reason we join such groups is because we're vulnerable. We're in a vulnerable state. So we might have moved to a new city to go to school and we're away from our family. We might have lost a parent or a spouse. Someone that's very dissatisfied with their life. They're not happy with their life and they're looking for something else. And of course, folks who are recovering from substance abuse issues, the church is all over them. And they are very, very vulnerable. So it's vulnerable people, like people at vulnerable times in their life who end up falling into such groups or getting sucked into such groups. Nobody joins a cult. People join a good thing. People join a community or a happy group or whatever. Some people end up in these groups because they really want to make a difference in the world.
True.
They're just good people and they want to make a difference. But the love bombing that goes on overwhelms the ability to think critically and make wise decisions. And so get sucked in that way.
It's true. And when you break down the psychology of cults or groups, that's one thing I appreciate about Escaping Utopia. She talks about these groups, they're similar in that they have what she calls a transcendent belief system. So they're going to change the world. And it's not necessarily it could be a religious group, but it could be a new age group. It could be a self-help group. It could be a business cult like an Amway. We're going to change the world. And so, like you say, the person comes along at a particularly vulnerable point in their life And this is a wonderful message. Let's get involved in something that's bigger than yourself. We're going to change the
or
world.
political groups, like
Could be
Yanya
anything.
got trapped into a
Marxist
political group. Yeah. So, and again, we're going to change the world. We want to see change in the world. We want to help bring it about. So anybody, we are all vulnerable at some point. It really drives me crazy when people say, well, I'd never fall for that crap. Well, you know what? You actually might.
It's true. And we know as well, it's not about, people say, well, people who join cults or something, it's because they're stupid or gullible. But oftentimes it's the more intelligent people, the more well-educated people.
Yes.
I mean, look at the people who were joining Nexium, Keith Raniere.
Yes.
Some incredibly well-educated, very bright people were sucked into that group and horribly abused by Keith Raniere and the top sort of lieutenants in the inner circle.
Yeah. And it's very much a cult structure, cult mindset. And we see that in MLMs too, multi-level marketing scams and schemes. And we know that those burn through churches like nobody's business, because they offer the promise of, you will be so successful. You will make so much money. You will never have to work again. You can spend all your time witnessing for Jesus, rather than you won't have to be working to do it. And so then slowly your closet and then your bedroom and then your dining room fills up with all this junk that you have to buy through the MLM. And then eventually you're sleeping like on the couch because it's the only place where you have room.
Exactly.
So yeah, MLMs are another
cult.
Detrimental group. Yep, that's right.
Exactly. I went through recently Rick Allen Ross's book, Cults Inside Out, and he has a whole chapter on Amway and how that's a cult. And he talks about, like you said, they use deceptive recruitment tactics. And I suddenly started thinking, when I was living in the States, I was recruited several times by Amway people, and they absolutely used deceptive recruiting tactics on me. They just flat out lied to me when I said, is this Amway? No, it's not Amway. It's not Amway. Wow. It was Amway. They flat out lied. So they tried to suck me in, so.
That is like Christianity in some ways, because the end goal is we must convert as many people as possible by any means that's required. So they're excused from fudging the truth or stretching the truth or lying. No, it's not. Just come on out. It's just going to be really good music. It's just a great musical band that's going to be performing tonight, instead of, you know what? No. And even the whole thing of it's not a religion, it's a relationship. That is so incorrect. Like they're trying to repaint it and rebrand it. But of course it's a religion, like many other religions, and it has risen and it will fall like every other religion. But they don't like to hear that.
It's true. Well, I mentioned too that I got a message from a woman in New Zealand. Maybe you can answer her question. I actually responded to her chat and I told her about you and I told her about CORT 2022, but she says, her background, she's originally from New Zealand. She's in her mid-30s, married with 3 children. They've been living in Australia for 8 years, but have recently moved back to New Zealand. And she comes out of the IFB, which is the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church. So she's been out for about 5 years. She says, I'm an agnostic now. Now, here's her question. She says, I'm reaching out to you because I've just started studying psychology at university, hoping to eventually go for my master's to work in research and help for people who have experienced religious trauma and spiritual abuse. I wanted to ask you if, in your time talking to people who have been through those things and speaking to professionals who deal with religious trauma, there's been something that stands out as a particular help to them. So she's reaching out to a few people. Is there anything that you would say to her that stands out as a particular help in terms of helping people with RTS, religious trauma syndrome?
I really do tell people that the starting point is to read Leaving the Fold by Dr. Marlene Winnell, because she really just lays it out and it's so relatable for those of us who grew up in it. What it's like to feel pressured, when you're in that situation, and then also how difficult it can be when we leave that situation. And then she also has some really helpful exercises in that book. I encourage my clients also to spend time doing values clarification exercises, because our parents had values for us. They put those values into our mind. So now, if we're no longer bound by the religious beliefs that they are, our values may look entirely different. Like, guaranteed autonomy was not on that values list before. If you're a religious person or in a high demand group, I hope it's pretty high on your new values list. And I will also say, it can be helpful to do sexual values clarification for those of us who grew up indoctrinated by purity culture. And so this is a plug for the next conference I'm hosting online in October, which is specifically for people recovering from purity culture. It's called Shameless Sexuality, Life After Purity Culture. And one of our speakers is Erica M. Smith, I believe is her name. And she runs a program called the Purity Culture Dropout Program. And she is just going to be a marvelous guest, but that's going to be a really big conference as well. So yeah, I think doing values clarification is quite important when we are rebuilding our lives. And even so, you can do it, compare it to what were your values before? What are your values now? You can have your partner or your spouse, fill it out. What are their values? You can see where they're overlapping. And you can, if you feel like there's areas you want to strengthen yourself in, you start moving in that direction. So those are some of the things that I encourage folks to work on.
So true. Other than the values clarification, that was pretty much the answer that I gave her as well. So I said, have you read Leaving the Fold by Marlene Winnell? And I also said, if you're able to go to CORT 2022, see if you can make that happen. I mean, obviously she's in New Zealand, so it's a completely different time zone and day there, but she could still access the recordings afterwards. So she may be reaching out to you at some point.
Yeah, and the recordings are still available from CORT 2021, and that was such a huge, powerful conference, and it's a ridiculously good deal. It's very inexpensive to get those recordings. For people who are wanting to attend CORT 2022 or buy the recordings, if people are in a difficult financial spot, we have discounts available. We have student discounts. We also have a discount code that we can give your followers and folks who watch this and listen to this broadcast, a discount code for podcast people. Right. So I don't know if you want me to give that now, or you want to include it in the write-up in your Patreon.
Yeah, I'm thinking, why don't you go ahead and let's tell people, where do they go to find out information about the conference, and how can they get this discount code as well?
Okay, I am going to look it up and make sure that I give the right.
And make sure you get it right.
Yeah. So the code that they can use is called podcast 20. And it's all one word, and it's 20, and the P is a capital P for podcast 20. And they can go to religiostraumaconference.org. And also they have the option, if they want to get a deal, they can purchase all access pass for CORT and for Shameless Sexuality at the same time, and they save $50 US. If they want to check out the Shameless Sexuality conference, that is shamelesssexuality.org.
Right. And then finally, how can people get a hold of you? What's the best way on social media if they want to chat with you and get more information about CORT 2022?
Sure, they can. Well, I'm on Twitter as @wise_counselor. Counselor has 2 L's, the Canadian way, or
the British way.
Divorce Religion. That's right, the British way. @Divorce Religion, all one word, is another one of my handles on Twitter. Also, come to CORT, all one word, and CORT is CORT, Conference on Religious Trauma. They can find me there. I'm on Facebook just as myself, Janice Selbie, and people might see some of my ads popping up these days for the conferences or for the Divorcing Religion workshop. If you see that ad, please feel free to leave me some words of encouragement, and take time to read through the words of unencouragement that people who are very religious take the time to leave on all of those. It really kind of proves the point about religious trauma. That's for
so
sure.
Threatening, isn't it? So absolutely threatened by, as we said the other day with I talked to Dr. David DeAndre, and he said that, we're like an intellectual contagion. These people that have left the church or left a religion, they don't want to catch it. It's like having COVID. We don't want to catch it. So they have to go out of their way to prove that we're heretics or worse.
Oh, yeah. And I'll invite your listeners also. They can go to my website, which is divorcing-religion.com. And there they can book individual sessions with me or learn more about my workshop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm so looking forward to this conference. I've already put my slideshow together. I'm working through it. So I've got to do a little bit more work on it. Plus, you and I, you're going to be there in person. I can't make it in person, but our mutual friend, Dr. Terry Daniel, is doing a conference in July in Portland, Oregon. I think she said you're actually coming down there to do a presentation in person. Is that right?
Yeah, because it's not too far from BC. It's a beautiful drive. So we'll head out there, and I'll be able to talk in person, and I'll just be sharing my testimony, basically telling people my story of going from being very religious to not being religious.
Not religious at all.
Yeah, it'll be interesting.
Well, thank you so much, Janice. I know you've got stuff to do. We will be seeing you at CORT 2022. And again, online in July, and you'll be in Portland. I won't be. I'll still be in the UK, but I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation as well. So thank you so much. And I will see you in a few months for CORT 2022.
Looking forward to it. Thanks. Take care.